Hi, guys. Welcome back to Doctors Living Deliberately. I'm excited to have Dr. Kemia Sarraf with us here today. Dr. Sarraf is a board-certified internal medicine physician and CEO and founder of Lodestar Consulting and Executive Coaching. She and her team help high-achieving professionals overcome anger, disengagement, and compassion fatigue that afflicts their high-stress lives through trauma-responsive methods. Welcome, Dr. Kemia. We're so excited to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be with both of you. And your listeners don't know this, but we had a whole before the show going on, talking about all the intersections of our lives. We always talk about what a small world medicine is, and it truly is just such a small, beautiful world.
Totally is. Yes, I know. I had the pleasure of meeting you back in 2021 at the Institute of Physician Wellness Conference for Coaches. And that was where it sparked my interest to get to know you. And I participated in your trauma mitigation course. And that was just mind blowing, very, very impactful. So thank you again for coming on. And I think let's just dive right in and have you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and kind of what led you to where you are today.
Yeah. Well, I would say that one of the things that's missing in the bio is my background in public health. And it's a important missing piece only because that's really how I ended up getting where I am. I did a public health degree before I went to medical school. And what's so interesting about that, I've learned, I don't think I realized it at the time, but it informed not only the way that I learned, but the way that I practice medicine and sort of the worldview that I have. It was never the patient in front of me. It was always the patient in context. And it's just a slightly different paradigm. It also led me to have very much a salutogenic worldview rather than a pathogenic worldview. You know, in medicine, in the biomedical model, we really focus on what are the components that cause disease. Right.
Yeah.
And as internists, you know, and pediatricians also, we also try to think about, okay, what helps keep people healthy. But really the biomedical model is focused on pathogenesis. Public health really is about what are the conditions that help people to thrive and how do we create and sustain those, right? Ideally. Now I'm speaking in idealistic terms here because I'm a bit of an idealist. And so that is the salutogenic model, right? What are the conditions for well-being, for wellness? And so when I finished up in St. Louis down at Barnes, and moved up here to Springfield, Illinois, which is where my husband and I live. We live on a little farm just outside of Springfield. One of the things that at that time in my life I became very interested in was child health, community health, and how we could, if we could, create programming designed to support, sustain flourishing, right? And so I started a nonprofit called Gen Age Kids, Generation Healthy Kids, and it was really focused on all of those things. Well, our programming grew over the years, and here's where it gets interesting. As I was doing the research for, okay, what is underpinning the pathology here? What is underpinning the childhood obesity epidemic, the adult obesity epidemic? There are things beyond the obvious. What else is going on? I came across the ACEs study, Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, done in 1998, 99 by Dr. Vince Felitti and in partnership with the CDC. And that has informed everything that I have done since. A couple years ago, in I want to say 2015, there was a book that was published by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk called The Body Keeps the Score, which really looks at adverse experiences, it's severe adversity, right? Those things that we would call traumas, and how they impact health over a lifetime, sort of underlining what we found in this initial research, the ACEs study. Now, the ACEs study has been replicated and validated many, many, many times. What's interesting about it is in children, it looks at what we might call the Big 10, right? It does not go on, and nor should it have originally. It really was just very, very cutting edge thinking at the time. It did not go on to look at and the 10 beyond the first Big 10, right? What it called, the impact of oppression, the impact of poverty, the impact of racism. It didn't go on to look at anything that might happen after your 18th birthday, right? When you begin occupying an adult body, but you're actually not an adult. I don't know when we actually become adults, but I'll let you know when I get there, because I think I get there before you two do, at least in terms of age. And so it just, it's an incomplete. I began building all of our programs with that in mind, right? With that idea of what does it mean to be trauma-informed, trauma responsive to the populations that we work with. And so this became over, 12, 14 years as I was doing that work in particular, just became reflexive, right? For me, I like to think about fluency. There's a fluency that develops when we work with a certain paradigm over time. So flash forward to 2014. I'm sorry, I'm trying to now remember the year, 2013. And my eldest son, Joseph, who was 13 at the time, is racing through my house on a Monday morning, half naked as my 13-year-olds always seem to be anyway. And I noticed that one half of his body is just absolutely black and blue, top to bottom. And I called him over and I took a good look at it. And, he had a great excuse for it. He's like, "Oh, Mom, I was wrestling with Tommy on the bus, and Tommy was his best friend and 3 times his size, 3 times my size at the time." And he said, we just were wrestling. And I thought, that's not what I'm seeing here. And in fact, I knew, the kind of the way that medical mamas, medical daddies sometimes know that what they're looking at ain't good. I knew what I was looking at was leukemia. And so as we moved through that day, the call to his pediatrician, the trip to his pediatrician, that look that you exchange with your pediatrician across the exam table as he palpates liver and spleen and goes, "Well, it could be." And you're like, "Yeah, we both know." To the ICU. I mean, we were in the ICU by 2:00 that afternoon with a white count of 130,000, one lonely platelet. That's how I like to phrase it. One lonely platelet doing its job, doing its damnedest. And ultimately a diagnosis that meant 3.5 years of daily chemotherapy, a really, really intense first year. So I, of course, was able to step away. That was the privilege of my life at the time, really step away from the work that I was doing, the leadership in this nonprofit, just to take care of my son. And I did. And I really, for any listener who's out there, I really do want to acknowledge the fact that that was an immense privilege not available to most people, right? I had the privilege of my education, that I knew what to do to take care of him. I also had the privilege of our financial situation, which meant that, we weren't dependent on me for insurance. So about 1.5 years later, one of my best friends came and scooped me up. She's also a doctor. She said, "You haven't left this damn house, barely. You certainly haven't left this town in the last 18 months. And we're going to go do some CME. You need to think about something other than cancer." And I said, "You're going to take me away for the first time for continuing medical education. What the hell kind of friend are you?" And she said, "Well, I got to go. So you got to go with me. I've cleared it with the husband, blah, blah, blah." I said, "Well, where are we going?" This is January, mind. She says, "We're going to Baltimore."
Oh, jeez.
February? Are you kidding? So she looked at me, she said, "There will be room service." It was the room service that got me to go, if I'm completely honest. So I went with her. And as it turns out, dirty dog friend that she is, it wasn't CME at all. It was a coach training intensive. And what she knew about me was that I was arrogant and snotty enough at that moment in time that had she told me that's what we were going to go do, I would have rolled my eyes so hard they would have popped out of my head and like skittered across the floor. And that the only way to get me there was to lie to me. Thank you, Wendy.
I love her.
And so, yeah. And so we went through this training intensive. And what was brilliant and beautiful and fascinating to me was, holy hell, there's this entire skill set and way of being in healing spaces with people that I not only knew nothing about, but had no skill in yet.
Yes.
Right.
Mm.
And so I began practicing. I began really doing the work of learning this other set of professional skills. And the thing that I loved so much about it is that those skills were so congruent with who I was sort of at my core. That was number one, but also so freeing. I did not need to have the answer for any longer, right? And for someone who, and I imagine this might resonate with the two of you, when you spend your entire life being responsible for having the answer for, and then being responsible for the outcomes of that answer, right? To begin to understand that we also can practice, also not in place of, but also can practice the skill of holding space long enough for people to surface their own answers and experiment with what does and doesn't move them towards that. This concept of growth towards abnormal stages of adult development, of a lot of things that started really surfacing for me as a result, was just beautiful. And so when I began working, and I wanted to come back and work with physicians, because one thing I had noticed in, those years with Joseph was how brittle and burned out, those were their words, so many of our colleagues were feeling. And this is 2015, 2016, right? And I thought, well, let's coach around this. Let's do this. So that's where I began. What very quickly became apparent to me, in those first few years, was that what I was seeing was something more than burnout, something beyond burnout. And also that the way that I coached, and I didn't realize this immediately, but that the way that I coached was very much from a trauma-informed paradigm, because that to me was like breathing, right? It's no longer a hat. The fluency was there already. It wasn't a hat that I took off and on. And so in about 2018, I was approached about actually getting detailed in how this paradigm worked, and in beginning to teach other physicians, physician coaches in particular, how to do it. And so I began developing that training program, that sort of advanced coach training program, in partnership with Dr. Ann Deaton, who's a clinical psychologist, been in the field of coaching for, 35, maybe 40 years now. Sorry, Ann, if I'm dating you. And Antoinette Ayers, who trained me originally and had been in the field of healthcare coaching her entire career, from a corporate perspective. And, we launched this initially as in-person training. What was fascinating was not only how quickly it began to resonate with folks, because there's so much power in giving things an accurate name, and how well it worked. Not as a replacement for, right? I mean, these aren't coaching skills that are a replacement for any paradigm that we've already learned for coaching, or any platform from which we coach. These are additive. It's a bit like a fellowship, maybe, to sort of borrow from that. And then the pandemic hit. Right. And now I was pulled into a lot of public health work almost immediately for about the first 6 months. And as I was able to begin drawing back from that and really step back into coaching, and at that point I was doing a lot of leadership work as well. What I was seeing was that the stress had, for all of us, morphed into something more, but also that there was some significant opportunity in this, because what happens is leadership is often buffered for an extended period of time from the acuity of the pain that is happening to those they lead. That is not to diminish the stress and pain of leadership in any way, right? I do think we need to begin seeing each other differently from that perspective. It is to say that when you are the tip of the spear, you are typically better resourced and you are in choice most of the time, much more so than those you lead. And what we know when we start talking about trauma is that all trauma involves a real or perceived loss of control. All trauma involves a sense of ongoing threat. So activation, continuous activation of that threat detection system, and a sense of being under-resourced. Well, I mean, amongst other things, right? But these are the things that hit leadership hard. So that is what pandemic brought to the fore, right? Absolute loss of control, absolute ongoing threat, and significant under-resourcing from every level, internal resources as well as external resources. And as we often talk about, we all learned our first day of medical school, the dose makes the poison, right? So when we begin looking at stress, toxic stress, and trauma and the continuum that exists, there's an expansion of the paradigm around what is it that contributes to stress becoming embedded, embodied in us as trauma. And that continuous activation, that continual priming of our threat detection systems was showing up in that way in so many places with so many people. And so that leadership paradigm, how do we, we talk about brave coaching, that's our acronym to help people sort of think about what are the skills that go into trauma-informed, trauma-responsive coaching. It's also a brave leadership paradigm. How do we begin to lead in a trauma-responsive way so that we can build trauma-responsive culture? Flash forward to October, actually, of this year. And you may have seen that the Surgeon General released what is, I'm referring to it as the 5 essentials for rebuilding America's workforce. And it really is looking at, the harm that's been done and what do we need to create corporate and governmental and hospital cultures across the board from A to Z. Cultures that support and sustain and are salutogenic, right? That allow for people to step into work and not be harmed by the place they're working. And it was fascinating to me because when the report dropped, and I read it as a tweet first, 5 steps of a tweet, which there's so many things wrong with that sentence, that as I'm reading, I'm thinking, well, number one, exactly right. Yes, yes, yes. And number two, all of these have their roots, their taproot in trauma responsive culture building. Every last one of them, right? And so what has been laid out is here's the destination, here's where we want to be. And the question then becomes, what's the path? What's the path from where we are to that place? And that's what, in addition to sort of the one-on-one coaching and the coach training, that's really been the primary focus of my work for the last, our work really for the last 2 years at Lodestar, which is helping organizations and leadership to recognize and name what's going on. It is fascinating to me, despite the fact that my news feeds will continually feed to me stuff about recognition and understanding of trauma, in the society writ large, in corporate culture, in hospital culture, there really still is a lag in leadership understanding. They know something's wrong, and they're not sure what the diagnosis is. right? And what they're, even if they have a sense of what the diagnosis says, what does it look like to begin to heal? And so this is what I like to refer to as the hope in broken things,
Yeah.
right? There is hope in this brokenness because we get to look at all these pieces on the ground and say, oh, these are the pieces we're going to pick up to build something new or better or restorative. And some of this shit, sorry, can I say that? We're just going to leave on the ground. Should have never been part of it to begin with. We're going to leave it there for the earth to reclaim.
Yeah.
See what happens when you ask me one question? I'm going to drink my coffee and shut up now.
Well, I was just about to say, I'm so glad you talked about the fact that like this is what is coming up in your news feed. But there are so many physicians and leaders out there that have never thought about trauma before. And I know for me, it was never on my radar prior to finding physician coaching. And so there may be physicians out there that are hearing this for the first time and are number one, this could just be a mic drop moment where all of a sudden kind of the clouds part and they are seeing this for the first time, and others that may not see how trauma affects them day in and day out. And so my question for you is, what do you say to those physicians that are just kind of maybe seeing this for the first time?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would say is, of course,
Yeah.
this isn't part of our training. The ACEs study has been around for 30 years. Let's just back up. It's been around for almost 25 years now, right? I am outside of the field of pediatrics. Very, very, very few physicians are familiar. They're just not familiar with it. So, it's still to this day is not part of our training. The idea that trauma has a lasting impact on health in any way, shape, or form. Okay, so that's just like found at the foundation. And I want to acknowledge, Bessel van der Kolk had been doing that work since the late 70s, right? He became interested in this when he was a resident himself in psychiatry in VA hospitals and was seeing all sorts of symptoms, complaints, physiological complaints in his patients that he couldn't find a physiological root cause for, an underpinning. So he's been at this a long time. Let's go back even further to Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, who is a psychologist and member of the Lakota Nation, who has been doing work in historical trauma and healing of historical and intergenerational trauma in Indigenous peoples since the 1960s. And what is fascinating to me is that her original work is now, even though she isn't getting credit, is now what we are seeing over and over and over again people talk about when they talk about how we heal and move forward, right? The return to the sacred path, which is her terminology for how one moves from pain and trauma into transcendence of that trauma, has been around since the 1960s. So, the thinking has been around for a few decades. And we also know that that's a pretty short period of time overall. One of the reasons I think this hasn't been prominent or at front of mind for our colleagues, for doctors in particular, I think there are a couple of reasons. I think that prior to this, there has been a lot of worry, concern, both real and imagined, about what it means to seek help, right? Real licensure risk in some states, it's state dependent. So some real licensure risk around that. Perceived licensure risk, even if it's not real. Horror stories that exist out there around physicians who have sought, and I'm putting big air quotes here, mental health assistance, right? I think, again, coming back to errors in the biomedical model, this idea that we have separated mental health from physical health is one of the most damaging paradigms in Western medicine. Big fan of Western medicine, have a degree in it, practiced it, saved my son's life, right? And that is a particularly damaging paradigm. We are a system, right? And separating mental health from physical health has allowed us to stigmatize one, elevate, focus on the other, diminish research in one side, and it is just profoundly harmful. If I am emotionally, psychologically, mentally unwell, my body will suffer. And the repercussions of that may not show up for several decades, and it will show up.
Yeah.
Likewise, when I am physically sick, it is going to impact my cognitive, emotional, behavioral state. We should stop separating those two. Okay, I'll step off of that particular soapbox because I could stand there forever.
But
physicians don't seek help for that reason, number one. Reputational risk also kind of lands in there. Number two, I think there is a sense that I just was just talking about this 2 days ago. There's a sense that I'm going to dissolve from structure to soup. Like I'm going to step into talking about the pain, the anguish, the trauma, however they make the approach to begin with. And if I do that, if I pull away one tiny layer of the armor that I've built so carefully, I will dissolve into a puddle of goo on the floor. It's going to require, a decade on a therapist's couch. It's going to, and that sounded diminishing, and it's not. A decade on a therapist's couch is probably something every single one of us needs. Let me be clear. And there is a sort of unspoken belief that it is going to mean that everything has to come apart. What I notice, what the experience has been with clients and with organizations, because organizational trauma is every bit as real and harmful as individual trauma, right? Organizations are made of organisms. When the organisms in the organization are traumatized, they harm the organization, and vice versa. When the organization has been harmed, they harm those who work there, and around we go in this feedback loop that never ends. There's a belief that the path forward, that restoration, that repair, that healing is a undoable thing, that it is going to take something profound. What it takes is willingness to step into. It is slow work. Yes, we talk about it sometimes as slower, closer work. And it isn't as all or none. It isn't as, there isn't further damage done in the work, because it isn't about digging down, right? Being trauma responsive, that's a therapeutic model. That is for the experts, right? Those are places that trained therapists who have the skills and the tools to do that safely and well. That's their realm. And I'm very, very, very respectful of that, right? Learning to be trauma responsive is a different skill set and path, right? First, we become informed. We know that it exists. We begin to notice all the contributors. What are all the things that go into one's trauma or an organization's trauma? What are the things that cause the harm? Then we start to become sensitive and aware of it. What does it look like when someone's threat detection system is activated? Right? How is that showing up? How's that showing up in me? And then we can begin to get to this place where people name, oh, you know what? This has been trauma. And trauma is very subjective. What traumatizes, or what has landed at some point as trauma for me, may not for you, Michael, and vice versa, depending on a lot of different things. How well resourced I am, how well connected I am, what I've experienced previously in my life, what I know to do, what internal resources I have to bring to it. So trauma's not trauma.
Yeah.
But our paradigm historically has been that trauma is a singular event. And that paradigm is limited and limiting. When we begin to think of it as a continuum, what we begin to notice is that in that continuum, which many of us have been sort of swamped in, right? In that continuum, there are also places to disrupt,
Yeah.
right? So if we know the things that move us along that continuum, we also know how to engage with each other in ways that disrupt us from going further.
I'm reminded of we had a quarterly call with you last week for the Lodestar coaches. And one of the things that you brought up with the case study that we discussed was, how we want to create that safe space. And the way we created the safe space specifically was to say, we don't need to talk about anything that happened in the past. We're just going to come and move forward from here. And you bring what you want, and we're going to just talk about that. And I thought that was very powerful, because that in and of itself is just opening the door to help the individual feel like they can say as little or as much as they want. We don't have to dive into the past, but it's obviously naturally probably going to come up at some point when you're comfortable doing that. So that was very, very, I think, impactful. And the other thing,
it's worth really just sort of drawing a big emphasis under that, right? Because I think that the concern that I have, and also the concern that I think is a very realistic concern when one engages with people who are carrying trauma, is how do I engage and not do harm? And how do I engage and stay in my lane?
right? Exactly.
And that's it, which is that we number one, we name it. We just simply name that is a part of this coaching experience, but also we name that, while people may want to bring, look, if the idea is that therapy is all about digging into the past, and it's not, and the idea that coaching is all about looking to the future, and it's not, then let's also realize that there's always been overlap in that Venn diagram, right? And so people are going to show up as the complex individuals that they are. Right. The difference is that with coaching, you allow people their time and their space. If it's big, my son calls it big feelings. If big feelings show up, I'm comfortable with those, holding the space for that and allowing them choice in how much they bring or not. But being trauma responsive, trauma informed is really, to your point, is about not digging when the client is clearly saying not yet or not ever.
Right. Exactly. And the other point that was really just eye-opening for me when I began this journey was to recognize, I think even with your course, was that for me, med school was a trauma, right? We acknowledge that. I think for every physician, med school is a trauma, but more than half of us, I think the majority of us, don't realize that that's the case. You talked about things being out of control. It's out of our control. We're not listening to our bodies when we have needs that come up. When we're sick, we're continuing to work. So all of these things that we have done during training, and it was ingrained in our brain that, you have to put the patient first, you have to do this. All of these things have kind of traumatized us in a sense, and it's made us numb to know what's going on now that we're out, now that we're safe in a sense. We're still not able to recognize, hey, my body is telling me I need to rest. We still are pushing it off. And so I guess, can you speak a little bit about that? The micro traumas, in a sense, micro traumas that we might have experienced that we don't even recognize are there. And then the big traumas, obviously, like major life events or hardships, such as what you were talking about with your son. There's two different levels of trauma. And I think there's a level of unawareness with regards to micro traumas there.
Yeah, I think it's such an important, it's an important noticing, I think. There are a few different things, one is, I think, again, coming back just to the word trauma and how that lands with some people. I always want to be careful because it isn't trauma informed to name someone else's trauma for them. Right. So that perhaps there are folks who moved through medical school without recognizing the impact, when there may be some folks who were so well resourced in some ways that it didn't, that wasn't the experience What I will say about it, though, that's I think is exactly to your very important point, is we're coming back to this idea of dose.
Mhm.
Cumulative and compounding dose over time without appropriate sort of countermeasures to that.
Mm.
And so there is a cumulative and compounding impact of this. Unrelenting, undisrupted, unmitigated toxic stress will, over time, begin to embed itself in our bodies in ways that is maybe unnoticeable in the beginning and very impactful over time. And one of the things that I do think is close to universally true about medical school and residency also is it's a bit amputational. The training is a bit amputational, at least at the time that we went through.
Mhm.
I think so still now. I see it happening with the students and residents that I work with even today. To exactly what you're saying, we are deliberately ignoring our normal body's normal signals, right?
Mhm.
To sleep, to rest, to nourish ourselves with something other than graham crackers that you find at the nurse's station, right? I lived on those graham crackers at Barnes. With to rest when we ourselves become ill,
Mhm.
right? I remember getting very sick as an intern, to the point that I had to take a few days away. I had a horrible bronchitis. I don't even remember what I could have had pneumonia for all I know. Because did I see a doctor other than me? Hell no. Right. So and that one incident, that one time that I took time away, that's the one that stands out in my mind from my intern year.
Right. We still
Yeah.
have a little bit of guilt and like, what's this going to do to my colleagues that are there? Are they going to believe that I'm really sick? Are they going to think that I'm just faking it? Because I don't, so
Weak. That's the word we use, right?
yeah,
Weak.
exactly.
Strong work. And
Yeah.
what's the opposite of that? You're weak.
Yes.
If you have to, rather than you're human.
Right. Right.
You're
And this is
human, and you're a human taking care of sick humans. And
right.
let's not carry that sickness in and risk exposing them. But even more importantly, let's recognize that what we tell our patients also applies to us,
Yeah.
except we're supposed to be something more than human. We're supposed to be superhuman or subhuman. I'm not sure
Yeah.
which of those is actually what's being taught, but it is very amputational. And so what that does to us over time, I can tell you to this day, you've heard me say this before,
Mhm.
I do not recognize when my body is telling me, girl, you're sleepy.
Mhm.
Now, I have great sleep hygiene because I have forced myself to learn that as part of my own health and wellness practice. And if I don't tend to that, I don't notice,
Yeah.
right? It just is, it's like a little bit of a broken pathway. I just don't notice that I'm sleepy. I don't notice those signals.
Yeah.
Well, there are a lot of those switches that we turn off. Thirst, need to use the bathroom to pee, that disembodiment, that sort of cutting our heads off, again coming back to that mental health, physical health, almost that cutting ourselves off from the rest of our body has really profound implications, because what our systems will do is it will get louder and louder and louder until it is screaming at us to listen. And when it begins to scream, and we can no longer ignore it, I don't want to say that it's too late. It is that we are at a point of it's a tipping
Toxicity.
point that feels like breaking.
Yeah, it's that toxicity, and that's what almost scars us.
Yeah.
That's where it's the beginning of this internal damage per se, where we don't even recognize that that's what's happening. So,
And the behaviors, the thing that makes me so sad about it is that the behaviors that start to show up are not us either, right? Like bring me the first year medical student who says, I want to be the surgeon who's throwing scalpels across the room 10 years from now, 15 years from now.
Yeah.
Bring me the ER the first year medical student who says, I want to be a clipboard flanger. Bring me the medical student who says, I want to be a closet drunk 20 years from now. Or, I mean, bring me that student. That's not how we go in.
Right. Exactly.
Right. We go in with all kinds of beautiful, sweet. I love first year medical students. They're so squishy and delicious, right? We go in with so much joy and hope and stars in our eyes for this profession that I love to this day so much. And it chips away, and no one is teaching us the skills to, either patch those chips back on or protect from those chips, because no one taught our teachers or their teachers, that do one, see one, teach one model sucks. Because we perpetuate the do one, see one, teach one of harm too.
Right. And we're changing that now.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
And
one thing, that really spoke to me is when you were talking about how the whole medical education process is cumulative, right? Because I too was that kind of wide-eyed first-year medical student that transformed into the angry GI fellow that nobody wanted to interact with, that nobody wanted to deal with, because and I would blame it on kind of the 20 consults a day and the relentless barrage of pages and being woken up all night. But it's 100% true as well that the trauma was cumulative over time, and where I can look back at medical school with smiles and look back at, 3 years of internal medicine with smiles. When I think back on my fellowship, I see trauma, right? And so, but these are not things that I recognized before finding coaching. And so can you give us, what would you say to physicians? Do you have maybe 2 or 3 tips about what to do, how to recognize it, where to go?
Yeah. It's such a great question. And I want to just also say thank you for that transparency and honesty, and Arpita as well, because it's not an easy thing to reflect on ourselves in this way and say, oh, I became the asshole who I became the right. But here's the thing is that and we'll use the word trauma, it demands discharge. Right. And we will either discharge it out, and it shows up looking like what you just said, anger, aggression, these behaviors that we go, who in the hell is this person? And at the same time, well, if you were living my life, you'd be showing up this way too.
Right.
Yes.
100%.
Or it gets directed inwards, right? And so the discharge can also occur at self. We hear a lot of physicians talking about, and I threw the phrase out there, becoming an alcoholic. Well, that's sort of tail end, but we also hear a lot of physicians talking about the ways they self-medicate, right? And it may not have crossed whatever invisible line exists into addiction, but still is harming them, right? And they see it and they know it. So trauma demands a discharge. Others, or depression, and the cycle that can get into makes it harder to do one's job. Right. So if you become the angry doctor, right, those around you, activation begets activation. You show up angry, people are going to show up defensive. You show up angry, people are going to retreat and not do. Right. And then around and around we go. So what we start to notice is that there's this activation, counter activation feedback loop. Just like I was talking about organizations and individuals, there's a feedback loop in our daily engagement too. Okay. So here's the tip. It begins with noticing and having a name for it, right? Every bit of this work always begins with self. And what physicians have been trained to do is look at others and diagnose problems in others. And so taking a step back and saying, we're going to begin with self. This is not to say the system isn't broken. This is not to say your team isn't broken. This is not to say that healthcare isn't broken. Yes, yes, yes. And let's begin with internal reflection. What are you noticing? Let's give it a name. Let's learn to notice it sooner. So here's the brilliant thing about this system that has evolved, right? My amygdala, my threat detection system, gives me physical cues that I'm picking up something that it is reading as dangerous. The cues will show up in my body before it shows up here. Why? I don't need this prefrontal cortex to fight off the face-eating bear, right? This is not what I need when I'm engaged with an apex predator. What I need are my fists, right? Or my feet, or to drop and pretend I'm dead, right? So, but it will give us little embodied signals very early on. Coming back to Arpita's very insightful question, the problem then is that we are disconnected from what's happening. We haven't paid attention to those signals for so long.
Right.
Reconnecting with this and beginning to look for, notice, and get curious about those signals is a first step. And what follows quickly on the heels of that is then curiosity about, okay, wait a minute, am I actually in danger here? Or is this really primed, sensitized threat detection system misreading, misinterpreting, miscuing what's going on? Because the damn thing reads physical threat and social threat in exactly the same way. It activates the exact same pathway.
Right.
It doesn't differentiate between face-eating bear and I'm about to get kicked out of the community.
Right.
Reads them the same way. Social threat and physical threat. And so we can begin to get curious. We start to notice and that activation. So my activation now, what I notice very, very, very early is my activation always starts in my throat. That's my first embodied signal that says something feels threatening about this situation. I have colleagues who talk about tingling in their fingers. I always love it when they're like, oh, I get pain in my shoulder, and they grab their left shoulder. I'm like, well, that requires a trip to the cardiologist. But, it can show up in the gut. People like, oh, I've got this, like, I get these weird butterfly, gross, I'm going to throw up feelings in as we begin to tune into that. So we've noticed it. We start to name it. Am I in danger, or is this a misfire? Then we get into choice. How do I want to navigate? I call this the 5 N's in case anybody's wondering. Notice, name, navigate. Normalize. Sorry, normalize is the third one. Navigate and nurture. So normalizing is, oh, this happens. This happens to me. This happens to Michael. This happens to Arpita. This happens to everyone. Not that we want to normalize trauma. The goal is to reduce trauma. We want to normalize the fact that these are universal experiences. That's why we say same, same, same. People start talking about their experiences, and the first thing that comes up is fear and shame. I'm the only one. I'm the only one who had to take days off as an intern and feels ashamed about that, weak because of that. I'm the only one. When we sit with someone who goes, oh, yeah, I get it. Me too. Same, 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 right? Suddenly we have this exhale. Our threat detection system doubles down on us by telling us to self-protect, right? Armor up, be alone. We're hardwired for threat detection. I can't do anything about that, nor would I. It's kept us alive for, millennia. We also are hardwired for connection. And it is that connection that, before anything else, will disrupt, will mitigate the traumas we've experienced. And unfortunately, the traumas we experience disrupt our desire to connect and rewire us to self-protect. As physicians in particular, when we begin to notice that, when we have names for what we're doing, I'm self-protecting because I am disengaging, I am disconnecting because I am, right? I'm harmed, I'm afraid, I'm whatever, I'm miscuing what's happening, then we can be in choice. So we've noticed it, we've named it, we've normalized it, now we navigate. What does it look like when? How would I choose to show up for this? What does it look like when the best version of me shows up for this? What does it look like when I say, I'm sorry, that does not work for me?
Mm-hmm.
It's my favorite.
Yeah.
Anybody takes anything from this, I'm sorry, that doesn't work for me, is acceptable, right? When I choose something different.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, how can we nurture each other? How can we look at each other and say, it is okay, it is appropriate. In fact, not only is it healthy, it is helpful for you to set boundaries. Boundaries aren't about keeping people away. Boundaries are not about keeping people out. Boundaries are about, what does it look like when I am standing in my integrity, when I am showing up as the person I want to be.
Mm-hmm.
And when I am clear about that, I am so much more useful in this world. I am a better mother, partner, friend, coach, physician, teacher. I have something to give. When
Right.
I don't get clear about that, and I simply let pieces of me be pulled away, I end up a bit of a shell.
Yeah.
And that person is brittle and mean. God, she's mean and
Yes. Oh yeah.
angry.
Totally. Totally.
I don't like her. Nobody else does either.
Oh gosh. Well, Kemia, this has been so enlightening and so just full of nuggets and knowledge and pieces that I think a lot of our listeners will be able to kind of implement and really take away and grow from. Um, I want to be mindful of our time, but I do want to ask, how can our listeners, if they want to learn more about your program or if they want to reach out to you about trauma-informed coaching, tell us how they can do that. What's the best way to get in touch with you?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. Now I'm looking at the clock and realizing I took us way over your allotted time. So my apologies for not tending that guardrail.
So good, though. So good.
This was, I want to just say before you tell, I mean, this is incredible. I loved all of this, and it's
So
so
good.
informative, and I'm so grateful that you took the time to
Yeah.
explain all of this, because I think, again, just bringing us back to, this is something that we as physicians do not talk about. And I am
Right.
so glad that the conversations are growing and that we are learning to, I don't even want to call it untangling, because I think you touched on it. It's not an untangling, but it is about a noticing and allowing and a recognition. And so I appreciate all the work that you're doing. I just wanted to take a moment. And now, please tell us how people can find you.
Well, I love that. I love it when I get to meet someone new. And I sort of watch, even as we were talking, I could see the wheels spinning faster and faster. There would have been smoke coming out of your ears if you were a cartoon character. And I love it. And I get to see that all the time, because we really do want to have a better way forward, right? I mean, none of us would have dedicated the blood, sweat, tears, and time to this profession if we didn't truly believe in what it is meant to be, in its best version of what it means to be a healer.
Yeah.
And I think that the path back for all of us is shorter than we are afraid it is. The fear which prevents us from stepping into the space, the fear is that it is dark and undoable. The truth is that the path back, I think, is much clearer than we are afraid that it is, and shorter, actually, even than we are afraid that it is. And that the more of us who are engaged at the same time, linking hands, linking arms, very kumbaya, to do so helps us to get there faster. And so you can find us at Lodestar, Lodestar PC, stands for professional coaching, lodestarpc.com. We have classes that are up on the website. We've opened all of our first half of 2023 courses are open. Those are our Brave coaching, our trauma mitigation masterclasses for coaches.
Which is amazing, by the way. I will say it's an amazing
Oh,
course.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And the other thing is that we do have an incredible group of coaches, affiliate coaches that people can connect with on the website as well. All of them have worked with me extensively. They are not all physicians. Many of them are. But we also have nurses and public health professionals and deans and associate deans who are in medical education. We have attorneys. The harm is beyond just the medical profession, and probably 50% of my clients, my private clients right now, are from industry, are from businesses, our C-suiters from other places. They also are experiencing this. So there's a universality that is daunting and hopeful, again, because as more and more people recognize this, we can learn skills to engage differently.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Amazing. So good. It's all so good.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Sarraf. I am so honored to have you on our show today. And we look forward, we may have you come back and talk more about some of these things. We really, really enjoyed it. So.
Well, I don't have very many things to say, so I'd work hard to come up with something new.
I love that. I love that.
Oh, thank you
Right.
all. Thank you both. This was really a lot of fun for me, and I appreciate all the time and space you gave me. I really, really do.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Bye-bye.